Hello, everybody. Welcome to Renaissance to Modern Art. So, this week and probably the next 2 weeks following, we'll be looking at chapter 32 because there's a lot to cover. All right. So, first, I'm going to start off by showing this piece of art by Picasso. It is oil on canvas. It was painted 1911 to 1912. So we're going to start off chapter 32, talking about one of the biggest movements that changed the landscape of art into, from the past, Renaissance, Baroque style art, to the art that we see in a lot of museums today, more conceptual art forms. So this is analytic cubism, which is a style developed by one of Picasso's contemporaries, Georges Braque. So the title means "my pretty one," and so this refers to a very popular French song at the time and Picasso's muse. So at first glance, you look at it and the painting appears to be very abstract, and it's just a bunch of fragmented geometric shapes, and it has a very muted palette. But upon closer examination, you can, if you look at it long enough, you see a woman with a guitar. And so a fascinating feature is the inclusion of the text Maujolet, so painted directly into the canvas. So blending language and visual art. So this was also something that challenged the boundary between text and image, and it added a poetic layer to it. So the painting plays with perception. So Cubism, the theory around Cubism is that you're looking at something from all angles at the same time. So if you're looking at a still life or a woman or a man, a guitar, you're looking at it at every angle in a single instant. So this was bringing art up to a more intellectual level also. All right, so I'll go over this week. So chapter 32, and this will be about 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how much we get through. So Fauvism, Cubism, Primitivism, Expressionism, Futurism, and Dadaism are the main art movements that we'll be talking about today. So the discussion question for this week is one of the most significant stylistic shifts in the history of art occurred between the movements of Impressionism, which we looked at a couple weeks ago, and Cubism. So this transition marks a very dramatic change in how artists perceived and depicted reality. So what we see on the canvas. So a stylistic difference. All right, so discuss in the first part, we'll discuss the theory, so the artist's ideas, and the stylistic differences between Cubism and Impressionism. So a stylistic difference is in painting is the unique way that the painter uses techniques like color, shape, brushstrokes, or perspective to create a distinct look or to express an idea. And then, do you feel like understanding the idea of the artist helps you understand and appreciate a painting more? So for example, the painting we looked at in the previous slide, for looking at it at the first time, and if you are not, let's say you don't like abstract art, but once you learn about why the painter made it, if you learn that he had many ideas about like perception and looking at it in many different ways and how he made color choices, does that make you appreciate the painting more? You might not necessarily want to hang it up in your in your house, but or you don't necessarily even have to like find it aesthetically appealing, but you have an appreciation for it. You wouldn't just dismiss it as being something like not important. And then for your journal entry. So how did Picasso's treatment of space and Les Demisoles d'Avion dramatically change the practice of painting in the West? So that will be your journal entry. And so that is in the book, but I also believe that in the discussion question homework on Schoology, I put a link to the MoMA where the painting's at, so you can like read more information about it there too. And it has a lot to say about the painting. And then later this week, or probably in my next video, I will talk more about the final and also post about that. So that will be coming, well, not for another month, but I definitely want to give you a heads up. It's not going to be much different than the midterm. You will discuss a piece. Probably it's going to be comparing like two pieces of art together, just to give you an idea. All right, so Europe and America in the early 20th century. So we'll be discussing art between 1900 and 1950. So in the early 20th century, World War I reshaped political, economic, and cultural landscape of Europe and America. So the devastation of the war left many people disillusioned, leading to intense ideological battles between communism, fascism, liberal, what we know as like capitalism today. Each system sought to provide solutions to the instability that was happening and the economic hardship that was happening. So the 1929's dark market crash and the Great Depression deepened these crises and causing mass unemployment, poverty, and political unrest. So as economic conditions worsened, tensions among European nations escalated, fueling nationalist movements and more grounds for authoritarian regimes. So some notable authoritarian regimes across Europe during this time were the fascist and communist governments. So in Italy, there was Mussolini, who had a dictatorship that emphasized nationalism, militarism, and suppression of political freedom, not being able to, talk about your political beliefs. And then also, of course, in Germany, Hitler's Nazi regime rose to power during this time. And of course, this led to a lot of economic despair and exploitation and horrible massacre of Jewish people. And then in the Soviet Union, Stalin, he also solidified a communist dictatorship. So this was state control, economy, also not being able to express your political opinions. And so these things were happening during this time. Okay. And so also dramatic changes in scientific knowledge unlocked the utility of nuclear energy. So many innovations in technology and manufacturing led to longer lives, better transportation. And so also there was the discovery in atomic physics, including Einstein's theory of relativity, which paved the way for harnessing this nuclear energy. And it would influence both energy production and warfare. And so then technological and industrial innovations, such as the assembly line and mass production, improved efficiency, and this really helps fuel the economy during wartime. And it led to better infrastructure, faster transportation, and better medical advancements, which led to longer lifespans. And then for psychology really emerged and had a really big influence on art too. So Sigmund Freud, which is very much known for the unconscious mind and behavior, which many artists really, explored his ideas and put that into their artwork. And then also another important scientist during this time was Pavlov, and his work on conditional reflexes for the foundation of behavioral psychology. And so these were important things that were happening during this time. And then so geographically, we're looking at the map of Europe, the Americas, and North Africa from 1900 to 1950. So this reveals, you could say, shifts in territorial boundaries and spheres of influence due to the global conflicts that were happening during this time. So in Europe, there was the collapse of large empires, so the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, Russian, and the German. And then after World War I, the map was kind of redrawn to this creation of very smaller, often unstable nations such as Poland, Finland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And then after World War II, Germany was divided again into West and East Germany, and controlled by the Allies. So the Eastern Europe came under Soviet influences, and which formed the basis for the Iron Curtain. We're not really going to talk about Africa much, but in North Africa, much of the land was still remaining under European colonial control, particularly by France and Britain, and borders remained largely unchanged in this area. And so in the Americas, the USA, the United States geographic isolation from European war zones contributed to its emergence as a dominant global power. So when the USA became involved in World War I, it kind of went from being an isolated country and started to dominate itself, as it has. So Latin America also experienced fewer boundary changes, but remained economically and politically influenced by the U.S., especially under the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt's corollary. So these geographic changes, they reflect there's a lot of shifting in power and a different world order that's happening during this time, and also fueling really quickly advances in industry and transportation and making the world a little bit smaller. All right, so first, early modern art and architecture in Europe. All right, so modern art began as subversive and intellectually demanding as well as radical. So it wasn't very well accepted. However, most art was still bound to this idea that works of art were very precious objects. But as we'll see later, the Dadaist movement and the Surrealist movements would change or challenge these ideas. Okay, so first we'll look at the Fauvist movement. So this movement was active around 1905 to 1910 and is one of the first avant-garde movements. So avant-garde, like art, making art for art's sake. Not making art for necessarily to sell, not necessarily being commissioned to make it, but you're making art for the idea of making art. And so this Fauvist movement was one of the first avant-garde movements of the 20th century. And it was led by artists such as Matisse, Derain, and Vlaminck. So the term Fauvism comes from Las Faves, meaning wild beasts. And so this was a name coined by a critic who was shocked by the artist's bold use of colors, and they use it in a very non-realistic way. They use it very intense, often clashing hues straight from the tube. So, not mixing them, just using them straight to express emotion and energy. So it's much more about the act of making a painting than it was about, how it was going to be, look perfectly at the end. And so one of their most iconic exhibitions was in 1905 Salon des Automne in Paris, where their work stunned viewers with its vibrancy. So it is a short-lived movement, but it did influence Expressionism, which was a much bigger movement, and then abstract art. And so interestingly, most Fauvist artists had classical training, but they deliberately broke away from it. And that is how academic art, like in universities, kind of developed to be. The first classes they would take would be very traditional and academic, like life drawing, learning how to see and put things down correctly. But then artists would choose to go off in a different direction and use color and line and brush strokes, or making a sculpture in a very more expressive, personal way. But in many ways, you can still see that sign of classical training and that knowledge if you look closely enough. All right, so Derain's Mountains at Collaret depicts a recognizable landscape that is conscious of itself as a canvas covered with paint. So Matisse explored a desire for deliberate harmonies in The Woman with the Hat, and presenting the non-naturalistic colors, blunt brushwork, and an otherwise ordinary subject. So first we'll look at Derain's Mountains. I'll show that. And then The Woman in the Hats. And so you can see here too, even though the colors are very expressionistic, he uses warms with cools to add some 3D to her face. All right, so Henri Matisse's Les Boers de Bibre transforms hedonistic pursuits within a pastoral landscape into a vibrant arrangement. So colors contribute as much to the joyous mood of the naked revelers as the figures themselves. So the composition contains continual movement, but at the same time, simultaneous energy. And you can see here the circle of trees and the circle of people dancing. So it's a lot of circular motions happening within the painting. Okay, so primitivism and the coming of Cubism. So Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque worked together to invent Cubism. So the ism allowed artists to comment on modern life and explore the choices involved in the perception versus representation. So primitivism and the coming of Cubism. So this is a very key period during the 20th century. So they drew inspiration from African, Oceanic, and indigenous art. So stylistically, primitivism That's going to be the word I can't say today. Embraced simplified forms, abstracted figures, and non-Western visual traditions. So it rejected Renaissance ideals of realism and perspective. So artists were fascinated by the symbolic power and this raw expressiveness of primitive art, which influenced the fractured and geometric forms of Cubism. So technically, artists began breaking objects into flat spaces, depicting them from multiple viewpoints. So again, like I was talking about before, and this is analytic cubism, you're looking at like a vase of flowers, but it's like you're looking at every side all at once. And it also reflected Eurocentric and colonial attitudes by appropriating non-European aesthetics, so very much influenced by African art. So culturally, primitivism challenged traditional Western notions of beauty and opened the door to modern abstraction. So we'll look at Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is often seen as it's often seen as one of the very first Cubist paintings that was directly inspired by the African masks and Iberian sculpture. All right, so Picasso's early art. So during the Rose period, he painted the family of Saltimbanques, depicting psychologically withdrawn figures to an empty landscape. And we'll look at that. And then around 1906, Picasso began to incorporate African images into his work. So this is his Rose period, and you can see that the figures look quite more realistic. Okay, and then primitivism describes the European perceptions of relative cultural superiority and inferiority. So this painting, actually Picasso did make a lot of shocking paintings, but this is one of his most radical paintings of the time. The very simplified features and almost like the almond-shaped eyes show Iberian and African influence. So he's showing prostitutes from a brothel, somewhat in response to Matisse's Les Bohères de Beuvre. All right, so this is in New York, the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, and it was painted in 1907, and it was one of his most groundbreaking and controversial works. And it made a pivotal shift towards modernism, and it set the stage for Cubism. So this painting depicts 5 female nudes in a brothel setting. So they're rendered very fragmented. They almost look like the color puts their arms in pieces, like they're pieced together in angular forms, and their very sharp, distorted features break with traditional representation. So style and techniques. So his bold departure from naturalistic form is evident in his use of distorted shapes and angular lines. So this goes far from the classical ideal of the human body. And again, the African masks were a very important part of this, and it's a very flattened composition, which challenged the ideas of perspective and depth. So the use of geometric abstraction in the bodies and faces foreshadows future movements, such as Cubism, Modernism, Expressionism, and many other painters and sculptures. So it altered the practice of painting by challenging realism in its traditional narrative. So wanting things to look very natural and realistic, so mimetic form of painting. So this is very expressive and very raw. So he breaks away from foreshortening and the manipulation of space and form just paves the way for artists to think differently about how art can be made. Like it started to question what is art. So the initial version of the painting had a more conventional treatment of the figures, but he reworked the painting quite a bit to give it a more angular approach. And so the work's title references a street in Barcelona, Carrer de Anio, which is a red light district that Picasso often went to. And so this painting caused an uproar when it was first shown, as it was distorting the female body. And it had this confrontational nature that challenged like what were artistic conventions, but also societal norms too. So analytic cubism, Baroque carried formal experiments by reducing a landscape painting to geometric shapes, little cubes. So Baroque's violin and palette show gradual abstraction of deep space and recognizable subject matter. So still life items are pushed to shallow picture planes and fragmented. So, oops, as we see here. All right, so analytic cubism. So the portrait of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler depicts Picasso's first art dealer. So a man who saved many artists from destitution by buying their early works. So this style of cubism was named for the way artists broke objects into parts as a way to analyze them. And synthetic cubism, another form of cubism. Picasso's La Bouteille de Suzette, so Bottle of Suzette, is a collage composed of pasted elements. So it evokes both place and activity, and newspaper pieces contain references to the First Balkan War. Oops. And mandolin and clarinet was a work that was introduced the idea of assemblage, which combined found objects and non-traditional materials into three-dimensional sculpture. So it's like a sculpture. An assemblage is you're taking various objects and you're putting them together to create a sculpture. So the bridge and primitivism, Nietzsche's thus spake Zarathustra describes humanity's potential as a bridge to a more perfect humanity in the future, inspired by a movement of German artists. So this movement responded to Germany's rapid and intensive urbanization associated with feelings of alienation and anxiety. And then Eric Heckel's Standing Child represents a stylized 12-year-old girl staring at the viewer with a disturbing confident sexuality. So Emil Nolde joined the Bridge Group and brought his studies of African art. So masks juxtaposes complementary colors to intensify the painting's emotionality. So this is Standing Child. And here is the painting of Emil Nolde's masks. And Kirchner's Street Berlin captures the paradox of barbarism on the verge of being unleashed in urban life. So harsh raw colors and tilted, brutal perspective convey immediacy. So you could see immediacy, meaning like he felt this like urgency to paint it very fast, like he wanted to say something, he had something important to say with his art, and he was capturing a very quick moment, and that is what is meant by immediacy or urgency in art. So independent expressionists. So it refers to a range of early 20th century artists in Europe, especially in Germany and Austria, who used art to convey deep emotional and psychological traits. So often outside formal group affiliations. So stylistically, this movement embraced bold colors, distorted forms, and raw brushwork to express an inner turmoil, alienation, or spiritual intensity. And often it related to politics too. And so artists such as Egon Schiele, Oskar Kokoschka, and Kathy Kollwitz created deeply personal works, often featuring intense self-portraits, human suffering, or existential themes. So technically, independent expressionists rejected academic realism. So they used exaggerated gestures, expressive line work, and unconventional compositions. So politically, many were critics of rising nationalism, war, and inequality. So with their work, often censored or labeled degenerate by fascist regimes. So culturally, their art reflected the anxieties of modern life, especially in the wake of World War I. So an interesting fact is like, unlike members of Die Bruck and Der Blausreiter, these artists worked independently, yet their contributions were crucial to the broader expressionist movement. So you could think of the expressionist movement like an umbrella. There was like Die Bruck, Der Blausreiter, independent expressionists. So expressionism is kind of like this overarching style of art that encompasses many groups, either like stylistically or artists that just like to hang out together. So this is Kathy Kollwitz, so The Outbreak from the Peasant War series. And she did a lot of printmaking. So this is etching, which is a metal plate that is etched upon, and then it is put in an acid bath, and then it's rolled with ink and put through a printing press. And so Paula Modersohn-Becker trained at the Berlin School of Art for Women. So evidence of Gauguin's influence is apparent in the reclining mother and child, from the prominent eyes to the nudity. And this is this painting here. And I think there's also an influence from Picasso in just some of his works. Okay, Egon Schiele's self-portrait nude emphasizes the artist's physical and psychological torment. So his father's death from untreated syphilis affected his sexuality and his portrayal of women in art. So the figure lacks both hands and genitals, so this represents like a form of self-punishment for indulgence in masturbation. Oops. So you can see, you could think first, by looking at it, that maybe he just didn't draw the hand and just didn't draw the genitals. But once you kind of read about his past and you read like his statement of his art, you have a better understanding of why he chose to depict it this way. It's not left unfinished. it was intentional. So this movement, spiritualism of the Blue Rider. So this movement began as a homage to a popular image of St. George on the city emblem of Moscow, Russia. So the large blue horses by Franz Marc, which I think many of you might recognize, shows the animals enjoying a spiritual relationship with nature. So the curves of their body reflects the curves of the background and suggests a harmony with their surroundings. Yes, so you can see how the curve is repeated throughout the painting, which gives it a really strong sense of unity. And so spiritualism of the Blue Rider, again, so Kandinsky explored the relationship between painting and music, especially through the work of Arnold Schoenberg. So often he would call his paintings like Improvisation 28, which sounded like music scores or music pieces. Kandinsky painted without a subject matter. So the artist wanted viewers to look at the painting as if they were responding freely to a symphonic experience. And so you can see like many of the brush strokes, they almost look like you're looking at a music page and notes. Okay. So extending Cubism and questioning art itself. So Cubism resonated across Europe, Russia, and the United States, where artists interpreted and broadened the visual message of the movement. So in France, Robert Delaunay fused his interest in color with Cubism, and homage to Beurat shows the movement through bright circular forms. So this is Robert Delaunay, and he also painted with his wife, and they painted in the exact same style. So his wife, Sonia, fused analytic cubism with Fauvism and what was labeled Orphism. And so they declared their work to be defined by simultaneously a here and now concept. Sonia created and decorated Citroën to match one of her fashion ensembles. So yes, so often she incorporated her art stylistically into furniture, clothes, and so her style crossed many, many things beyond painting. So Fernand Léger developed a purist version of Cubism based on machine forms. So this was a style affected by his wartime experience. So Three Women is a machine age version of the academic reclining nude, the traditional reclining nude that we've seen in many paintings. Their bodies, ranged with a geometric grid, seem to be made of interchangeable parts. So it's very industrial and, yes, very machine-like. So the Futurist movement was based on the thrill, speed, and power of urban life, and this started in Italy. So following Marinetti's foundation and manifesto of Futurism was the technical manifesto of the futurist painting, stating that previous subjects must be swept aside for the show, to show the love of steel. So basically to show the love of industry and innovation. So it celebrated speed, it celebrated technology, it celebrated modern life and industrial power. So it was very aggressive, showing aggressive energy, very bold lines, repetition, and it rejected traditional forms and glorified war and innovation. So seeking to revolutionize both art and society. but it was quite short-lived. So Armored Train in Action was probably based on a Belgian photograph. So Severini used jagged forms and splintered overlapping surfaces to depict a violent scene from a disorienting viewpoint. So the artists believe the concept of war as a social cleansing agent. And this is the painting Armored Train in Action. So Umberto Boccioni's major work, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, was inspired by Cubist figure studies, and it featured exaggerated muscular curves and counter curves expressing the figure's force and speed. Okay, so here's a sculpture of Futurism. So you can see it's very bold, blocky, and aggressive. And in Russia, Natalia Goncharova adopted avant-garde French styles with ambivalence. So she created a new Russian style known as Rayonism with Mikhail Lorinov. So electric light displayed simplified cubist shapes and dynamic futuristic concepts, or dynamic futurist composition. So it is a study in enhanced colors and is a symbol of technological advance. And you can see it's very interesting that all the colors are kind of isolated from each other. She uses color. There's some blending and gradients of color, but it's all very separate. So it's a very unusual composition. So Kazimir Malevich emerged as the first artist of truly non-representational art. So, and this is always debated, like who was the first real non-representational artist? Some say Kandinsky was, others would maybe talk about Picasso, but suprematist painting, 8 red rectangles, focused solely on formal issues. So an effort to liberate the essential beauty of great art. So the Russian avant-garde supported the revolution that broke out in 1917. All right, so considered the first truly non-representational. So formal issues. So these formal issues that we're talking about in art is where things are placed in the painting. Like where these squares are placed. Formal issues refer to basically just the elements of art, like space, color, line, form, and I think shape. So that's what the formal issues are referring to. And you're doing that without representing something that's recognizable, like as a dog or a ball or a bed or a person. So toward abstraction in sculpture. So Konstantin Brancusi admired semi-abstract forms of art and believed that the artists of such works successfully captured the essence of their subject. So the newborn relates the shape of the human infant, and torso of a young man distills the figure into 3 essential metal cylinders. So this represents, it's supposed to be like very compact and tight like a newborn, but in its abstract form. And then here is torso of a young man, which is like an assemblage, different pieces put together that When they're put together, it represents the torso of a young man. So Dada, so questioning art itself. So the beginning of the opening of the Cabaret Voltaire in 1916, the Dada movement mocked the senselessness of rational thoughts. So it questioned art itself. Like, why does art exist? So it was like an anti-art, anti-establishment response to this devastation of World War I. So Dada artists rejected conventional aesthetics. You know what? I am going to cut off the lecture here because Dadaism, we'll have a lot more to talk about in the next class.